our scripture theme based on our topic, which is truth and consequences, and then subtitled, If You're Woke, Act Like You're Woke. Our scripture text is really from Daniel 3, 17 through 18. In my NIV, it reads, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Now, you know, it's funny. That phrase by itself, out of context, kind of sounds very shake your fisty oriented, and it sounds defiant. But in context, this is a really powerful statement, borrowing an adjective of Matt's, that Gene and I love this a great deal because there's a whole lot in this particular phrase. And when we get to the scenarios that bring this out, we'll talk through kind of some of the components here, because it takes a whole lot of brass to say what these young men say to the king himself. We started out, or we ended last week with a question that talked about, that's posed here on the screen. It says, why do believers struggle with the woke culture? And it continues to be my experience week after week that I expect people at large who don't know Jesus, who don't know Yahweh God, that they want to go along to get along. I understand that. But I can tell you it absolutely is surprising when I encounter Christians or people who are professed believers who get caught up in this stuff and, first of all, believe that they have to pick a side that's not Jesus' side. And then if they do pick a side, it's one that doesn't honor the values of what it is that they say that they profess. And the conversations are almost getting more and more difficult week after week after week. And so it regularly reminds me, and when I talk with my believer friends, I say to them all the time, this is why Jesus has so many reminders for believers to not be deceived. Because if you want to watch believers being deceived in what seems to be the face of obvious deception, it's today. And let me give you a silly political rhetoric that a friend and I were talking about a couple days ago, and then I'll try to break from these kind of politics. There was a person that was going around from campus to campus asking college kids, who are our smartest opponent of our community today, asking college kids, based on phrases that were statements from a political figure, who said the statement and what they felt about that. And one of them, and I'll mention one of them so you'll know this, and here's one that was mentioned is, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Okay? And so the college kids, because again, they're the bastions of knowledge in our community today, answered that all of these statements had to definitively come from Donald Trump or Donald Trump's camp. And watching Steve's face there, you can see they were grossly mistaken. They all came from Joe Biden. Now, when they originally identified these statements as coming from Donald Trump, they got on the hate bandwagon. Well, this guy's a racist. This guy should be taken down. This guy, this guy, this guy. When it was finally revealed to them that the statements were from Joe Biden, they backtracked on the he's a racist. Then the statements became, well, maybe he was mistaken. Well, maybe he wasn't sure of. And so this bizarre double standard exists where people want to make right wrong and make wrong right. And so in the face of that, this is partly why Christians are struggling evangelizing, let alone getting involved in the fray, because some of us feel like we're going to get eaten alive in a discussion. Because when you present truth and when you present facts, folks don't want to hear them as truth or facts because it's really based on how they feel or how they identify. And that's the culture that we're in, and it becomes increasingly more so each and every week. So let me pause there and give you some opportunity to weigh in if you want to.
Well, one of the I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say.
Ladies first.
Oh, well, you're so kind. Steve and I have talked about this here just kind of in general that, you know, the things that you do hear on the media, they're only going to present you the side that fits their narrative and only pieces, parts of something taken out of context that would fit with their narrative. And if you try to, and then if you kind of hit them with facts or with other people that can support what you're saying, they just totally shut you down. They don't even want to listen to it. At least that's that's something that I think that Steve and I have talked about, right, Steve? I got to look at him and make sure I'm saying that correctly because I'm not in the same room. But it's challenging, and my mom even asked me a couple weeks ago, what does woke actually mean? Okay. Well, yeah, and she texted me this, and I took it upstairs to Steve, and he's like, how do we explain this to a 74-year-old, you know? And she's like, well, I keep hearing it, and I don't think it's a good thing, but it's hard to tell, because sometimes it's hard to discern if it's good or bad based on the way it's presented. Correct. Yeah. So that's all I had to say on that.
Well, and that just flows right into what I was going to say. The reason the quote-unquote believer world has issues with this is because it is so deceptive. Woke sounds like a whole lot better than, sleeping at the wheel. Woke sounds like it's something that should be good, but at the same time, it also, according to our definition, what Christian wouldn't want to be behind justice? What Christian wouldn't want to be behind people being treated properly? And so it sounds like something Christians ought to be behind. But then as you begin to delve into it, there's a whole double standard. There's a whole deception behind that. There's a whole other agenda that you don't hear about. And part of that is the second thing I want to mention. As long as they thought it was Trump that said these things, blast him. I don't care for him, so but as soon as it becomes someone they are fond of, then all of a sudden there's a benefit of the doubt that comes in that they're not willing to give the other person because they don't care for him. And so that's where the double standard is. That's what I heard was, okay, if good old Joe said that, maybe he just was mistaken or he misspoke, or because obviously he wouldn't have said something crazy like that to sound like Trump. And so, and again, Trump gets no benefit of the doubt because that's just contrary to their belief system. So that's what my view is. Number one is deception that makes it sound like it's something that should be good and isn't. And number two, they give the benefit of the doubt for the guys they like and not the ones that don't.
Other folks? Okay. So part of the reason that we can have this discussion is, and I mentioned this before, is a guy that has my melanin content and my tan is introducing and offering the opportunity to wade in here where typically you might be disinvited to this particular party. Now, I want you to hear, that's a phrase we're going to come back to as we continue this lesson. Invited to, disinvited to the party. And it's just a euphemism to talk about the standard that exists today. And you'll recognize it when we start talking about some of the particulars that say when it's okay for you to be able to engage and when it's not. And so when I take a look at some of our participants today, there are 4 of us who would be grossly and regularly disinvited to the party because of the invitation that doesn't get extended to them in today's world. And certainly because of the gender of 5 of us who are here, we would be disinvited to some discussion. And then certainly depending on your melanin content, there's a lot of you who would be disinvited to a lot of other discussions. And so part of our work together over these past several weeks is to help not add any additional armor to the whole armor that Paul tells us that the Lord gives us to put on, but to help you to recognize it's already a part of that and to use the sword of truth in a way that allows you to engage in the right way, as opposed to pretending you're weaponless, pretending that this is a fight you can't be involved in. And so that's why we're talking about the definition of the word woke. And Gene's right on. Yes, every Christian wants to be a part of social justice, by the way, which I say is an oxymoron. Every Christian wants to be a part of some movement that says that we're moving society in for the better. But the whole point, and that we've discussed earlier, is if you are awakened and awakened through Jesus, you're already not only a part of that culture, you help to initiate it in terms of the Western world's understanding. Because you being a professed and possessed believer of Jesus and his Holy Spirit, you've been awakened far before the woke movement came into culture 40, 50 years ago. And you need to own that the right way, and you need to have a boldness that allows you to then have a discussion with woke versus wakened, and you understanding the origins of woke, but then also helping to understand that being awakened is much more superlative than being woke. Because the very values that woke espouses are already inherent in the scriptures. And the funny thing about that is, a lot of times when my wife and I are able to engage with our kids, and when I say are able to engage, when we're not about to rip our hair out with the stupid that sometimes comes from them, we say to them, the answer to what you believe are the world's social and other ills is to follow the tenets of Scripture. And just like the Joe Biden, Donald Trump discussion I mentioned earlier, they don't want to hear that part of the discussion. They don't want to hear that. Now, if they're having a really good day, especially my son might say, well, okay, maybe you're right about that. But you can hear when he says that, at the end of that, there's a huge B-U-T. Because if you admit that the scriptures are the answer, now you open a whole different door. And that different door is one Westerners especially, if not people in general, don't like. And that's accountability/responsibility. And that's a part of the world we live in today. And so we're going to help with us being good standard bearers of the bloodstained banner to know that we've got a great offensive weapon, which is the truth, and we need to know that, unfortunately, there are consequences when you go into a battle with the truth. So, a couple of items here. Your skin color may disinvite you from this particular woke culture conversation. That's a reality. So we're going to leave that out there because we're going to come back and visit that. I mentioned to you last week a couple of bullets that you don't feel with it enough. That may mean you don't know enough about current events. You don't know enough about the politics and the environment. So, okay, so once you admit that that's the situation, fix it. There's enough information on your mini little tool here to at least help you get briefly up to speed to be able to stay in a conversation rather than not enter it at all. You may feel that you don't know enough about the culture of wokeness. So that's why we're spending some time with this, to help you understand that wokeness is not new. And sometimes because we're older people, we think if it's new, then we're not hip enough to get into it. Well, it's being bent a little bit differently than it first appeared, say, 40, 50 years ago. But the concept has been around for 40, 50 years. And you being able to engage in such a way is going to at least allow you a different feeling of invitation when you perhaps felt off limits previously. You're not confident enough with your own beliefs and Jesus' relationship. Okay, so that's why we spend time doing this on Sundays, to remind you, you have a relationship with the very creator of the universe. You have a relationship with the very answer to the human problem, who came and made the answer happen and then was resurrected to say, see, I'm really who I told you I am. So we need to rest in that power. People are going to use the phrase rest in power versus rest in peace. We need to rest in that power and act like we are citizens of the Creator and his family and his children, as well as his servants. And then lastly with this, and this is one that the Bible tells us, keep your lamps trimmed and burning bright, because you know not the hour when the master of the house returns. Right? That's kind of a little bit of King James made a little bit relevant for us today, and less King James is. Christians get caught off guard. Stop getting caught off guard. Think that everywhere you go, that there's potentially a social opportunity for you to interact and engage with somebody, and you're going to encounter weird. So be aware with the weapons of our warfare that are not of this world, to be able to engage folks, as opposed to, well, let me get away from this person as soon as I can. The feeling that most Christians have when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to their house, the feelings that most Christians have when the Mormons come to their house. Don't get caught off guard by going, let me get the heck out of here. Let me have enough information to invite these folks in for a cup of tea and more. So let me be quiet there, give you some time to weigh in if you need to. Okay.
Hey, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I missed you guys when you met out at your house a couple of weeks ago, and that's kind of when you started this whole woke thing. Did you talk about liberation theology back then?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I hadn't heard it over the last couple of weeks, so I figured you must have gotten into that pretty deep.
Yeah. You know, and I appreciate you bringing that up, Bruce, because that was a part of the intro here, to talk about how the woke culture and liberation theology go hand in fist. And many people that have your melanin content level don't know about that, because it's kind of ingrained in the culture that has more melanin, but it's a mystery to most of you guys. And I'm going to say something that's political, but it also has its faith roots. And if you want to comment on this or come back to it, I want you to think about this. Because I've had this conversation with some of my like-minded, brown-skinned people over the past several weeks. When Barack Obama got to be president, whoops, okay, you're going to hear noise in the background. Hopefully that will go away soon. When Barack Obama became president of the United States, in many ways, where we are as a culture, we could have almost eliminated this had he almost said two things. Let me give you the first thing, that in some ways, the reason I voted for him, I believed he was going to say if he got elected. First thing he should have said was, thank you, Jesus. There is no way that this small-town guy from Hawaii going through the Ivy Leagues and having the family struggles, there's no way that I had ever thought that I would really become president of the United States. Now, from the background that he had, that I understood before he became president, I thought there was a chance he could have said that. Here's the second thing that he could have said, which was this. I don't know where you are, I don't know where you live, I don't know what your backgrounds are, but I want you to recognize something, that if you believe that empirically there is systemic racism in the United States, I am a living, walking example that it no longer exists. And had he said those perhaps two things, we would be at a very different place in our American culture today. Your comments, your thoughts.
Well, if he had said that second thing, wouldn't he have actually ended up betraying his upbringing in the black culture as it is or has been over the past 50 years?
Beautiful question. And that's why sometimes folks with your melanin content don't wade into this. The answer to that is yes. But here's why that yes is okay. When you understand who Jesus is, you understand your relationship with Jesus, liberation theology doesn't hold a place there. Because the whole point of Jesus is the liberator. And so when we talk about with his stripes we are healed, as opposed to our churches teaching that there's healing from sickness and healing from disease and illness, the healing is the animosity or the enemy status between God and man, which supersedes the thinking that our culture is held hostage by other people with different melanin content. So would it have betrayed the liberation theology? Yes, in some way. But as a Jesus believer and possessor, he would have been within his rights to say that. Yes.
Right.
Brilliant question.
Well, the other thing that came to mind as you were speaking on that is, and as we were reviewing, the thing that came to my mind was there's another kind of deception that's, we talked about the deception that draws in quote-unquote believers because they want to be a part of justice. Last week we talked about it, and I think Bruce is the one that shared it. If you go to the Black Lives Matter world, they're being deceived too. Doggone it! If I'm black, I want to have the same rights I'm supposed to have, and that sort of thing. And so, Black Lives ought to matter. And yeah, at its very simplistic point, that's true. Everybody's lives ought to matter. But the folks who are behind this engine that has that name have a different agenda. And they need to, the folks that are buying into that need to do their due diligence and say, what do these people really stand for, and do I really support that? So there's deception everywhere, and we know who the author of that is.
That's the remarkable point about Black Lives Matter. The statement is almost like, did God really say? See, there's just enough truth in the phrase that you buy it and you think, but at the same time you think that there's something that's missing. Planned Parenthood. Who doesn't want to experience Planned Parenthood, right? Women's choice. Who doesn't want women to make choices? See, there's enough truth in the phrase, but if you look at it from a Jesus possessing and Jesus professing standpoint, did God really say? It's the same thing, just couched in a different phrase. And so Dean says, would President Barack Obama have in some ways denounced the whole liberation theology had he said what he said? Yeah. So what? When we get into talking about the truth and consequences later and talk about these scriptures, you got to make a choice sometimes in the midst of what's popular or versus what it is that serves the Lord. And that goes back to when these three Hebrew boys say what they say. So I believe, and again, I'll try to back off this soon. I believe that there was a chance that when I learned that this guy who was Harvard educated, who came from Hawaii, who had his background the way that it was, who announced that his pastor had introduced him to Jesus. By the way, this is all about the only time I heard him say Jesus when he was running for president, who introduced him to Jesus, who said he was married in that church. I believe that he would have the guts, that if he understood what the phrases of hope and change from the 60s meant, that once he got elected, he would represent what all of those forefathers upon whose shoulders he was standing, that's what he would stand for. But the agenda changed. The agenda changed to a political one, and make sure you thank that you glad hand everybody and you kiss all the babies who got you in, as opposed to being a Jesus-oriented agenda. Because I believe our country would be, and the world, because of the influence America has on the world itself, would be in a very different place had that pivot occurred with our last administration. And because of my melanin content, I can say that a little bit more freely, but I'm also in some ways extending the invite to get you guys invited to this party too. Go, Steve.
I'm not sure that I agree that it would have stopped it. I think it may have, at the very best, may have put a pause on it. But I don't think that this whole woke culture would have been stopped in its tracks because Barack Obama may have said, what you suggest. For example, critical race theory has been developing and growing stream since the 80s. And it started really taking off in our schools, and from schools it spread out to businesses and tech giants and all those sorts of things. So I think at the very best it would have been a pause. I don't think it would have stopped it.
Okay, and I think it's fair for you to say that because it's such a hypothetical, you don't know. What I'm suggesting to you is when I take a look in hindsight, right? The Ferguson, Missouri situation wouldn't have resounded the way that it did if President Obama hadn't weighed in on the Harvard educator and the policeman that he weighed in on soon after he became president, and he didn't have enough information about it. So there are many dominoes that, at least when I look back, that I see that the president wouldn't have waded into situations that created a racial charged country because his first statement would have said, I don't believe in it. So I agree with you, Steve, that it says that it may have put it on pause so that what we're experiencing now may not have happened during the time we're alive. And maybe that's in some ways what I'm strongly suggesting. Because remember, this same president got the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, then he would have almost been able to support what real peace was and winning that prize. And that would have affected people in a different way because of their feeling about this particular president. And I can also tell you that there were, when that president changed his perspective on what the family structure was, there were black churches who had their pastors apologizing to their congregation. When he changed his stance on what constituted a family, what constituted rights and wrongs, there were several institutions, so to speak, within the culture that have darker, more melanin that became now okay, that typically were not okay. Because this president said, I have evolved opinions on a thing. And so some of the disinvitation to the party says, these are things maybe you don't know about until they become news, but these are things that are on the DL, you guys understand the phrase, that always permeate the culture that has a different melanin content. These have always been things. So for instance, one of the big, funny, interesting things is that we have a lot of terrific choirs in churches with brown skin congregations. And a lot of times, their music leaders are homosexual. And we're okay with that as long as they don't admit that they're homosexual. Well, when President Obama shared his evolved opinions, now those folks began being comfortable letting their congregations know that this is what it is that I am, and this is how I'm going to go about it, and you need to honor me differently because it's okay now. That's kind of what I'm referring to.
Well, one other comment on that, the whole putting the pause on it sort of thing, I think Steve may be correct there. Again, it's hypothetical. But what we do know, in the 8 years he was in office, instead of having a positive influence on the situation, he actually was basically throwing gasoline on the fire. He was actually fueling that racism, and he has, as much as some of these people are saying that Trump has divided us, Obama did it even more so. Obama was a divisive and dividing factor during his administration because he was constantly bringing race into the equation. And that's just my own take on the matter, that if people were to look back and see how he functioned, I'm going to say it, this is being recorded, I don't know, if he had not been functioning quite so much as a racist himself, then things might have been different now, but maybe not.
What you just said, Gene, is exactly what it is I'm referring to. And the people that I know that have tans that are like mine, there are some things that we can weigh in about that you're not allowed to weigh in on. And let me give you an example, because I was going to talk about this as we went along anyway. And this is how we recognize that racial divide that in many ways had fuel put on the fire during the previous 8 years. I recognize the interesting position that occurs potentially if a cop is to pull me over. I've known that since I've been a young person. I've been taught in that regard from my parents, who had a high disregard for folks that have your particular melanin content. So I've had enough encounters to recognize when it is that I'm actually putting myself at risk. But now, as a person who's a little bit older and a little less, well, a little bit more afraid that actually a gun could actually take my life as opposed to me being bulletproof, and watch this, and I hope you understand this the right way. I don't put myself in situations where I need to figure out if my hands need to be up or my hands need to be on the car. And do you understand what I'm saying? You see, this is a discussion point that Black Lives Matter doesn't want to talk about. And the world, America doesn't want to talk about this, which is don't create situations where I'm on the police want list, where I'm on the police, there's an APB out for me. And if there is, when the police ask me to do X and so, do X and so. And if there's impropriety, my wife and I retain our lawyer, and then our lawyer goes after you afterwards. But I'm not going to put my wife, myself in jeopardy when the police ask me to do X and so. And see, you guys, some of you here, you can't have that discussion, but I can. And so from 8 years ago, had our president in some way endorsed our police, endorsed that there's a different way and that all experiences don't need to end up with hands up, don't shoot, that we wouldn't be exactly here where we are because our president would have supported if you make the right and best decision. That doesn't have to be the outcome. If you don't put yourself in position where the authorities are looking for you, then you're going to have fewer opportunities where you're going to be shot or tasered. If you don't believe that America is great, and I'm speaking, paraphrasing President Obama, and I'm a representative that this country has overcome in many ways a lot of the systemic stuff that this country in some ways was founded about. If you don't like it, you're not captive here. You can always go someplace where you believe that the opportunities are different. And had he said that, perhaps as opposed to a Donald Trump, see, the tone's very different.
And you just touched on something else, and this is why I enjoy our this is not Bible study for me. This is my mental exercises. This is getting my brain working. Do you recall when Donald Trump was running, various people of varying melanin tones said, if he wins, I'm leaving the country? Did they? No, because they know that this country is the best thing going, number one. Number two, there's something that I've begun to realize that I guess I've forgotten because I have a different attitude. There are still people out there that even if you're doing the right thing with your skin tone and doing everything just like you're supposed to, you're still a target because they hate you. They hate the color you represent. And when Maggie Walker's grave got desecrated some weeks ago, it was like, oh, those people are still here. We still have these people here. And even if you are pulled over because you're driving while black, that their mentality is if you're down in Louisiana or something like that, they see you and they're going, okay, immediately before you open your mouth, I don't like you, and so I'm going to figure out an excuse so that I can hurt you in some way or another. And so there is that element out there which I hate to say is there, but unfortunately I have to admit that it is.
And Gene, the fact that you said that is, I'm just going to add this to that. And that's why the race movement in the United States is not the same as the gay, lesbian, transsexual movement, because I don't need to know who you're sleeping with, and I would never know unless you have to tell me. But when you run in, you're unfortunately going to know that my melanin content is different from yours, and if that's the only reason you're making a decision that there's a difference between the two of us, that's a problem. And so the two movements, if that's what you want to call them, are not at all the same. I would almost make the women's sexual revolution more akin with the race movement than the LGBT junk. Right? And so, in the same boat, I would put this out here. And again, I didn't be political about this because I think it's all scripture-oriented, at least to help inform us to be ready for the conversation. If I don't want to be hit in a protest with a car, if I don't want to get hit in a protest with somebody's car, number one, don't be at the protest. Number two, get part of true civil disobedience, which is peaceful. Now, that's not necessarily something you all can say because you're not invited to that party. But I do want you to recognize that it's at least fair to understand and be aware of the argument, because as much as we don't like it, sometimes abstinence is the best way to stay off the target. And we're in a culture today that wants to make, remember when Steve talked about being the victim? We're in a culture today where being the victim is popular. So people want to be bizarrely in the crosshairs as opposed to just don't. And so sometimes knowing that as an alternative, I think, again, when you're awakened, you recognize, as unpopular as it is, the safest kind of sex is not sex with a condom. It's no sex. It's not a popular standpoint, but it's truth. Right? No.
Hey, Preston, I'm watching this out here right now. And this relates to COVID, right? We're having our cases going up, and I've engaged on social media a little bit, but I'm careful how I do it. They're blaming it, ready for this? Now, we haven't had tourists here since April. And there are still great numbers of people who say the reason that our cases are exploding is because of the tourists. Now, 1 + 1 = 3, right? And it's like the reality is what's happening is that people have started gathering together in large groups, especially at the beach, with not a face mask in sight. And so I made a comment the other day on social media. I said, we got to start owning our stuff, man. You can't always blame it on somebody else. I think that's what gets me so caught up with all of the woke culture, is this idea that it's somebody else's fault. Yes, racism does exist. Gene is right. There is evil in the hearts of men. Is it systemic? Maybe in some police forces it really is, especially in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Where you get called a diminutive name down there, Preston, because you're black. That kind of stuff still exists. Absolutely. We can't dismiss that, but to throw it all out. And to your point, you're right. I can't say, well, what about the stuff in your own community that's a problem that you've been grappling with for generations? And when does that come into the equation? But to your other point, Christians, the Christian culture just is woefully unprepared to answer the question. And I think it starts with this very simple thing. Are people inherently good? Are people inherently bad?
Right. Yes. And brilliant point, Bruce. Ultimately, that's where the awake conversation has got to drill down to. But because we don't have a God sensibility, because we're not truly Judeo-Christian in our Americana today, we don't want to believe that people are inherently bad. Right? And so I have a doctor friend. When Bruce mentions the COVID stuff, let's take a look at the COVID picture, even in this regard. If you have a problem with potentially being infected and catching COVID, stay home. Let the rest of us live our lives. Here's what I mean by that. We're at such a point in our culture, you can stay home and have all the stuff delivered to you that you need, for the most part, to live. So if you are afraid of contracting COVID, stay home.
Exactly, because that's the thing. It's, all of these things going on, the things with the schools, things with businesses, things with restaurants, whatever, people need to be able to live our lives, and agreed that we've had these conversations with my parents, which is why they don't go to very many places, because of their health conditions. Right. But that makes perfect sense.
Correct.
But if you are relatively healthy, right, with no underlying conditions, then let us live our lives. Are we going to get the disease? Possibly. Right. Is that a bad thing? Maybe, maybe not, because you start building the immunity. Think of the flu. Sorry, I'm just going to shut up now.
A lot of my friends and I have started to talk about the data, at least the data from this COVID stuff. And if you take a look, surprisingly, one of the places that's the least infected, ready? Drum roll, Africa. Yep, good look, Sarah. Now here's the funny thing. Some of the conditions where this virus is spread is when there are people who are uneducated, when they don't follow and obey what seems to be the disease transmission sort of stuff. They practice good hand washing, etc. And Africa is a place where people don't necessarily have access to all the things we have as a civilization, certainly as a Western civilization. However, Northern Africa, where you would think that there would be major deaths, almost has none, and I think there are about 14 cases in South Africa. So part of the magic is the northern part of Africa is they have such association with viruses, see Ebola, see malaria, see cholera, see et cetera, that they are actually actively staving it off with hydrochloroquine in some ways. The other thing is, they've got enough antibodies in many ways, and you're not reading enough of this data-driven information that suggests that this particular viral strain is not really difficult for them to deal with. Now, the reason I tell you that is to suggest that it really may be a possible discussion to tell people, let us live our lives. If you guys have a fear of COVID, then live like you're in fear. But that's part of what Paul's teaching is for believers, which is you're freed from the law. It doesn't mean that the things of the law are bad, but it means you don't have to live like you're captives. Jesus has freed you. So we need to live like people who, because our values are conservative, who are liberal in terms of enjoying life, who are liberal in terms of being able to talk with everyone about anything, and knowing how to eventually keep the main thing, which is people are inherently bad. Jesus is the answer to all the world's woes. And I appreciate that you're woke, but let me tell you what awake is all about. Let me take a pause there.
I had a thought occur to me just yesterday, as a matter of fact. I won't give you the entire story, but I went to go into a store that had the doors guarded by masked individuals, and if you did not have a mask, you were not permitted in. And because I could get what I was looking for elsewhere, I just said, okay, bye, and turned around and walked away. And as I left that situation, I began to think about the nursing homes here that have reported so many COVID deaths. And here's the thing that occurred to me. If that same number of deaths had occurred without this COVID publicity, because they had died from pneumonia or the emphysema that they already had taken its course. People die in nursing homes anyway, okay? But because there was this COVID thing, back to the evil that man have, there is a financial benefit to reporting COVID deaths because you get the institution gets remuneration from the government for those sorts of things. And so now we've got an evil administration and I'm not saying they are, I'm just suggesting hypothetically, if there's an evil administration at a nursing home and they're able to report COVID deaths, then they may get some sort of remuneration back. So now there's the evil coming in. But then on top of that, there is this publicization of this whole thing, so that even if they are or aren't, diagnosed, and I don't even know if they were, it looks like it. They're on a ventilator, but we don't know whether or not it's emphysema or whatever. They're on a ventilator. It must be another COVID death. People die from pneumonia more or from the flu more than those that have died from this thing. And because this is the thing that's in the news, this is the thing that's getting the news. Just my own opinion.
I wanted to make 2 points. First, on the COVID thing, it's probably been maybe 2 weeks ago. You guys have probably maybe seen it, but the CDC released a report where they did a study of deaths from COVID, and they based it upon how many deaths were listed solely due to COVID and how many listed to other comorbidities. And they're like only 6% of the actual deaths were due solely to COVID, which was like 9,100 people.
Yep.
As opposed, and they said it's some high percentage, like 80-some percentage, had 2 comorbidities at least. So I think the death rates are overinflated, which I hate to get political again, but I'm not sure you would have seen that if it wasn't an election year. To get back to your question, why do believers struggle with the woke culture, is I think something that we kind of overlook when we talk about this type of thing is that this culture is it's become a religion. It's a cult, and in a lot of ways you have to sort of treat it as a cult as opposed to more of a political sort of ideology. And I think you have to sort of look at it from that standpoint as well. It has infected politics and has infected businesses, especially big tech and things like that. But it's still it's a cultic religion.
I appreciate being able to have this kind of exchange with some of the minds that are on our panel, and I would really hope that folks are taking advantage of being able to participate in this from the recorded standpoint if they're not participating live, because I know that this, for me, this serves as fuel when I'm hesitant to perhaps get involved into a situation that I think is a little bit mercurial or a little hairy. It's this sort of thing. It's listening to and learning from a Steve. It's listening to some of the neat points that are bolstered by Gene. It's listening to Bruce in a very different cultural climate, being able to say, yes, these truths are self-evident as long as we're being honest about the nature of man. And that's really what we're talking about through all of this, is that the world is the way that it is because the heart is decidedly wicked. Who can know it? And we don't want to admit that, because then we'd have to, again, agree with God, and then we'd have to have accountability and some responsibilities. So we sugarcoat and make things as bright and as shiny, as Gene would sort of say, as we can, to keep liking them, even in spite of the fact that they're harmful and they're ultimately killing us. And they're going to create a situation where we're going to need salvation because we're staying enemies of our Creator. Thanks, Steve. Let me throw out a couple of other thoughts for you, and then we'll see where this is. Now, you've heard me say this before, and this is the kind of conversation where I can maybe better put this in context. As a guy that has some background that's similar to Sarah's, I like words. I like language. I appreciate how they go together. I like grammar. I like syntax. I like literature. I like that. If I don't like it, I adore that stuff. And so it's it's particularly offensive to me because of that background when words become off limits for people to use. Okay? Now, I'm not going to say, because there are two words right now in our United States or our Western culture that you can't use, but I will denote them for you. One is the N word and one is the F word. Now, here's the funny thing. The F word's not the F word you think it should be. And that's where I just want us to land a little bit to see this. If you're a person, unfortunately, who remembers the era that had a 7 in front of it and then a 0 and then has an apostrophe and an S, yeah, exactly, that guy. A comedian who was very popular, his name was George Carlin, came up with a routine that was about the 7 words you can't say on TV. And those 7 words, Christians, we've all endeavored to use those words probably during our lifetime. And I guess what in some ways fascinates me currently as a person of my age is those 7 words aren't on the list of things that are not permittable for you to say. We were told in a routine that you can't say, in fact, you would get censored or your show might have fines. Take a look at, see the Smothers Brothers from the 60s. If you even went close to some of these 7 words. But these 7 words aren't the 2 that you can't say today. So let me make this statement to you, and then I want to back off this a little bit. So you can use profanity, which are part of those 7 words. You can use profanity, which may have consequences, but using these 2 off-limit words will have. That bothers me in some regard. Go ahead, Bruce.
I just figured out what your F word was. Sorry. Go ahead.
The F word has its English roots in a bundle of sticks. I see you, Sarah.
It took me a second. I didn't realize which F word you were talking about because I'm thinking, you know where my mind went. I hear my husband laughing upstairs. So there's my laughter for the day.
Almost any TV show that you watch that is on a stream service has that F word in it. Because that's how acceptable that word is today.
Yes. Point of clarification. Another use for your F word had to do with cigarettes.
Yes, that's
in the English world.
It's fumaring over here. That's why it's doing that. So using one of those words may have consequences, but if you use one of these 2 words, it will have consequences. And I have a problem with that. Because sometimes in order for me to discuss my problem with supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, I need to say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. You sometimes can't defend or explain what you're not permitted to say or to use. And I told this to you guys before, and this is what's funny about this, and I think Bruce mentioned this earlier, and Gene echoed this. There's a double standard. See, the funny thing about the F word is none of us kind of can use it unless you belong to that particular parade. And then if you belong to that parade, that word is used pretty regularly. The N word has the same double standard. It's a terrible word. Oh, it's demoralizing. Unless you are part of the crew that regularly bandies that word about. And that's why I told you the story of the young lady who got on stage last week with the rapper who was invited to, who was of a different melanin content level, but got in trouble when she was invited up because she used the word that's a part of her hero, because that's the concert she's in. It's a part of her hero's jam. There's a problem with that. There's a setup there that's going on because you can't use those 2 words. And by the way, we're going to see those setups happening when we see Daniel have to visit the lion's den. So you got to know how to respond in terms of the truth of consequences query when you're put in a situation and you get set up. And the cool thing about Daniel's setup is if you read it, Daniel knew he was getting set up when it happened, and Daniel puts himself in position to go, I'm going to do this. So believers, in some ways, some of that track is where we need to be. So let me pause for a second and give you a moment to comment or have some feedback if you need to. watching Steve pretend to smoke his cigarette, watching you guys agree with me when I talked about a bundle of sticks. Think, words are words. And so sometimes, just like woken, you need to tell people you understand where the word comes from. And the N word, I can tell you for 30 years, maybe even 40 years before it became unpopular over the last 4 or 5 years, I've had the discussions of the root of that word forever, because it's a worthy discussion. And then once in some ways you have the discussion, you can help people to know you can use that word, but it has no power over me, because mostly when you use it, you have no idea what you're saying. And that's kind of helping to denature the power of the woke culture. When you can wade into the discussion, you can say, I hear you saying that, and you can say I'm not woke, but I'd rather not be woke because I know what woke means. I'd rather be awakened. And let me tell you why. But you got to be able to use the term woke in order to have a discussion about why it should be depowered. Kind of make sense? The next bullet question is, how should a believer converse with a representative of the woke culture? So here, let me give you my bullets, and then it'll invite some discussion. Practice sincere, active listening. Look, there are going to be 18 times when you're going to want to do two things. Punch the guy in the head, or go mad on the guy, punch him in the throat, which is even more debilitating. Or you're going to want to go, could you just shut up? Could you shut up? Could you shut up? And you need to listen. You need to let people finish their entire train of thinking. And listen. And then while that's happening, as crazy as it sounds, you need to be saying, Holy Spirit, guide what I say next. Holy Spirit, I got no clue necessarily how to do anything except punch the guy in the throat. Give me the right words to say. Help me to interact with this person in a way that's meaningful and significant enough that we can keep this conversation going. And then when you speak, after you've listened, address what you've heard as opposed to just the irksome content that you're experiencing. And here's the irksome content. You're a joke. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't have your facts in mind. Try to eliminate all of that stuff, but speak to the person after you've done some good active listening. And that means look engaged. Lean in. Give eye contact. All the stuff that in some way supports all the malarkey you're saying right now, I get it. I'm listening to. Now, I'm not telling you to do fake listening, but I am telling you to do sincere listening as opposed to what Steve is doing right now with the fake raised eyebrows and stuff. I'm saying really listen and then be ready for the answer or the response when it's your time. Ask probing questions to best understand their concern and issues. When you listen well, it's going to help you know where the target points are in terms of saying, how did you arrive at that? And what else do you believe? And how do you think that impacts you or your family? Those are things that you need to ask, because ultimately when people are annoyed or they think a certain thing, you need to know when you drill it down to its core, why does this bother you? Or why do you think this way?
Preston, I could have almost predicted your second point, and here's why. There's a commercial on television for hearing aids that I see quite regularly. And the guy who works in that center where you're supposed to go to get your hearing aids says that when he has someone come in as a potential patient, he does two things. He listens, like your first point. And then the second thing he does is he tests to find out whether or not they really indeed have a hearing issue. That's your second point. That's a probing. That's a testing to find out where they really stand on these things, because sometimes folks might use terminology that they may not really have an issue with. They may have an issue with it even though they use the terminology. So the questions is very, very important so that you're testing to find out where the issue might be with them and how you might be able to help them, which is what the doctor is looking to do. Can I help you with your hearing? I've got to find out what your issue is to find out whether or not I can. If you've got selective hearing and you only hear when so-and-so speaks, or don't hear, especially when so-and-so speaks, then no, my device isn't going to help you at all. But and that's kind of the preferential sort of, double standard sort of thing too. I don't hear when Trump speaks, but I hear everything Biden says, that kind of thing. So you can, there's a testing, and that's what this came to mind. I couldn't have come up word for word, but it is a testing.
This is why I appreciate Bruce earlier talking about managing his social media presence, because I would tell you, and I could be wrong here, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. You can't do these first two things very well on social media. and there inherently is a part of the problem, is because I didn't intend to say it at this particular time, but I will say it this way, and then this will make better sense. Part of the struggle with what Facebook represents, and maybe even Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, is no, that's not true. Let me stick with Facebook. In many, many, many ways, it's being used for purposes that it wasn't intended to be used for. Originally, it was a connection point to be able to maintain communication, maintain contact with people that potentially with whom you'd fall out of contact with. But now what it's become is, in many ways, it's a surrogate soapbox for people. And because you post something and then anonymously people are weighing in, depending on how it is that you allow yourself to be viewed, there is no real active listening at all that happens. And there really aren't opportunities for good probing questions, because there are a million different likes, dislikes, and postings that are targets of what you've said, and now you don't have any opportunity to get back and do any healing to therapeutically fix the situation. Okay? And so Jesus teaches that the woman at the well is a great example of how you deal with somebody who's got an issue, and then what the give and take is in terms of probing questions to get to what the heart of the matter really is. There's patience involved there. There's Jesus letting the lady kind of rant a little bit and then getting back on target, and then ultimately giving her a mirror to be able to hold up to herself, to be able to see, wow. And then having it change her in such a way that she, through her testimony, goes in almost and changes the entirety of the folks that are in Samaria because of her association with an active listening creator who's asking probing questions as to, where did you get there? How did you arrive at that? That doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But that happens through interaction that's face-to-face, person-to-person, as opposed to Facebook to Facebook, TikTok to TikTok, Instagram to Instagram, Snapchat to Snapchat. So I'm almost going to say, and I'm ready for those cards and letters, Christians, I think we're doing our disservice by doing our evangelizing through social media. Ain't going to do it. It's a tool, and if you use it judiciously, the way that I think Bruce, the way that Matt, the way that Bucky tries to use it, yes, but that's not the way Jesus intended for us to do it. So if you're doing your fighting kind of like war games, shall we play a game, where you are initiating warfare from thousands of miles away, that's not how you're supposed to be using your spiritual armor. It's engaging people with whom you come into contact day by day, person by person. That's how the war gets won. Even though, the war's already been won. That's how we handle our individual skirmishes. Another point. Remain calm, patient, and inviting. Okay, so I've had to get to be an old guy like now to be at this point, because prior to probably my 40s, I'm not necessarily, well, I'm right. So you, so you get about 30 seconds to make your stupid point, and then I'm going to tell you why your stupid point's all wrong. I'm saying, yeah, pretty much. I may have won the battle, but there ain't no more war opportunity because I just blew that whole bad boy up. I've gotten to be better as an old fogey, or as getting an older fogey, to realize mine. I don't need to win the war. Jesus has already won the war, right? But if I'm going to try to instill enough seed for the Holy Spirit to do his job, I need to be the right kind of engaging in this particular skirmish, in this particular melee. And that means I don't need to put a hand grenade into the guy's hand because I think it'd be funny, well, funnier than an M80 in his hand. I just put the grenade in because I think he's stupid. I don't need to decide that I'm going to use a bazooka because, well, I don't have my missile launcher, so let's just see what that does. So in fact, I may be inclined to reholster my sword and just let the person with whom I'm coming into contact set up what the particulars of this particular skirmish are going to look like. And man, is that a hard situation for those of you out there who like to? Yep. Yeah, but you know what? I think that's the thing in hindsight when we look back on shoulda, woulda, couldas. I don't necessarily have a whole lot of life regrets, but I have some regrets that I probably blew up some battles that could have been better handled, could have been better managed. And I'm glad that I have the opportunity to not blow people up the same way now. On occasion, I always carry, like, the Coyotes, TNT. I always have one of those, but I have to say, Lord, don't let me go to my Acme products because I can get there. And then my last point, let me open up the floor for you guys, is ask what their hope for society is with all their concern, with all their issues, with all their anxieties. Ask what their goal or their vision of the future is for themselves, their family, and society as a whole. All right, floor is open for you.
It had nothing to do with woke, but I had a homeless guy come to church last week, and we spent 45 minutes after the service with an impatient wife and mother-in-law waiting for us to have this conversation, and I'll just cook it down to this. He pretty much kind of felt like his life needed to be modeled prior to Genesis 3. And that anything that wasn't Adam and Eve in the garden was sin. And so we had a long conversation about that. And the reason I bring that up is I tried all of this, but there's this point where the person you're talking to is intractable. When they have just run that path so long that there's no variation for them. And you're just beating your head against the wall. I understand why Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine, because there you go. And so at the end of the day, what I finally shared with him, and I said, you know what, if that's what Jesus has put on your heart, maybe you're the leader of a movement. And he got a big smile on his face, and I was like, cool, I'm out of here. Thank you, Jesus. There's a point where you just can't beat your head on the wall anymore, though, man. That's all I'm saying.
Hey, Bruce, my question is, if he was all content with the way he was living, did he come in just for a handout, or was he actually looking for some sort of hope to improve his life other than the handout?
Amazingly enough, he was with another guy who's an older guy who seems a little more moderated and actually was singing with us and things like that. they didn't come for a handout. They actually were looking for other people to connect with. So, the door was open in a good and right way. And I'm hoping maybe that Edward and Adam will come back and we can have some more conversations. We didn't blow it up. So another opportunity maybe.
So we've got a Paul Harvey, rest of the story to remain.
We shall see. But I thought it was applicable to what we're talking about because it was the same kind of thing. These people get they get in their rut, and Preston, it's tough.
So Brother
Yep.
Bruce, the funny thing about you mentioning this and us having this discussion, you and I have done this together. And sometimes you need to, without it being overwhelming, if you need to partner with somebody, you need to know when you need to reach out to a Steve. You need to know when you need to find a Sarah and to go with you to be able to manage this, because Sarah's going to keep you from blowing up that particular hill. Because going with Steve, it's going to help balance you. I remember when, especially listening to Bruce talk about this in this particular scenario, Bruce and I were at a drug rehab situation together where we were trying to minister to folks who were recovering if they were from drug abuse, and we had one particular gentleman who has probably been on a certain tack to challenge Christianity for years, and it would have been very easy for, especially the combo meal of me and Bruce, to just go, Bruce, you got the dynamite? And Bruce would say, you mean I have the C4? And I'd say, yes, excuse me, let me go get the tank. And so the combo meal would have wound up looking like Iron Man obliterating some Middle East country. And if you know me, I like wearing it. I didn't even talk about the Iron Man suit, because if you have the Iron Man suit on, that's almost better than Acme products. But we didn't do that, especially because we were able to bounce off each other. We listened very actively. We're engaged positively with this individual, and we prayed for this individual as we departed. But what we didn't do is try to win the encounter, because at some point in time we recognized we were getting played. And believer, it's okay when you recognize that and then shake the dust off your sandals and move on to the next city, move on to the next skirmish. But if you don't know that, you've got to ask sometimes the Holy Spirit to engage with you to say, this is not a seeding experience. This is not a potential harvesting experience. This is a wasting of your time.
Yeah, man, I'm blown away every week, Preston, how everything you talk about, and I know I just jumped on, ties into where I'm going, but you'll see when I get there. A couple thoughts. It is sometimes about winning for us. It's about being right, and that's so selfish, but it's so in us as human beings to want to be right. Let me just say that for me. Y'all can make that judgment on your own, in your own life. Secondly, there used to be this term called seasons of the soul, and where people were more open at particular times in their lives than they are at other times. And if I blow it during a time they're not open, I won't get the opportunity to reach them when the time comes when they are open. Then thirdly, there's a gentleman by the name of Patrick Lencioni. He wrote a book called The Advantage, and it's all about emotional health and organizational health. And it's interesting, although Lencioni is probably not a Christian, he writes about the power of emotional connection. And when he does like consulting at companies, like these big Fortune 50 companies, he will spend at least the first day or two just about where everyone is in their life. And he told this story one time about these two guys who hated each other. It was known, 20 people in the room, these two guys hate each other. And the CEO asked him to deal with that. And he said, okay, I will. Well, the first day he didn't say anything about it. And the CEO was like, I thought you were going to deal with that. He goes, just wait. The second day they went around the room and told their stories. What's your story? Because finding out somebody's story will let you more into what why they're thinking the way they're thinking than you trying to just listen to what they're thinking. Because usually what I'm thinking is not how I feel in my heart. It's just me making a point about something. And on day two, everybody went around the room and told their story. And these two guys had the exact same story, abused growing up their whole lives by their fathers. And I mean, to the point they were in tears. Those two guys became best of friends because they realized why they hated each other so much is because they were exactly alike with the same burdens they had to had to bear growing up. And it created this very antagonistic approach between the two because they both were dealing with things that never really settled. So I just think, and let me just say this. I'm never, and I'll speak for me, I'm never going to have all the answers that the generations are asking, whether it be my generation or the millennials or the Zs. Who knows? Only God knows what's coming behind the Zs, Generation Z. I'm not going to have the answers for them. My kids, you know what? Brendan was telling me about someone who said something to him the other day, and he was trying, no, it was Luke, he was trying to make sense of it, and he was like, well, it's probably because they're just old. I'm like, what do you mean they're old? Like, how old are they? He goes, I think they're in their late 30s. And I'm like, thanks, Luke. And but I'm not ever going to understand completely. And for me to try to, and I think you need to try. I don't think that gives you a pass not to try. I think you need to do your research. I mean, Preston, you talk about that every week, and we have to do that. At some point, though, rationalism falls short as compared to the movement of God's anointing in somebody's life.
I just wanted to say that each of these bullet points that you have here are part of an apologetics technique, which Preston and I have talked about before, called the Columbo technique. And the apologist who describes this technique, his name is Gregory Kokel. And what he typically says is when you're in these situations, your goal isn't to win the argument. And you can't go in with the expectation that you're going to win this person that you're having this discussion with to Christ. He's like, what your goal should be is to simply put a pebble in their shoe, which basically means you're going to plant some idea in them, or you're going to by the questions that you're asked, that person is going to challenge a belief that they hold, and they're going to walk away from that conversation going, yeah, why do I believe that? Why? And that's going to stick with them. That's going to be that pebble in the shoe that maybe gives you the opportunity to continue that conversation later, or sets up the conversation for someone else, like another Christian, at some point down the road.
Right.
Hey, by the way, one of the cool guys to watch do this, if you ever want to have fun, is go with Charles Faroe out to the state fair. He goes out there every year. I don't know if you guys still support him or not, but he goes out to the state fair. He and June go out every year and set up a booth there for the Friends of Israel. And I've had the opportunity to go with him before, and he'll stand up there, and you get whoever comes up to the table. You don't know who they're going to be. And that, the word winsome comes to mind when you talk about Charles. And I wanted to deck a couple of people, and I just be honest, but Charles just has a sweet spirit, and he follows these directives so well, and disarms the most angry, lost people in the process. I hope I can be more like him when I grow up, but just really cool. So if you ever get that opportunity, go hang out with him for an afternoon at the state fair. It's cool.
Yeah, it's funny that Bruce would mention Charles, because Charles definitely has an unassuming personality, almost to the point where you think he is subdued, except he's really very vibrant when it comes to Jesus. He's just got a way of maintaining and managing himself where you kind of think, I don't need to think about that guy at all. I would almost tell you, too, for those of us in our generation, if you want to watch this display, because it's available to us, take a look at Ray Comfort stuff. Ray Comfort is an engaging guy in a fun and in a many personality way, where you can see how, when Steve talks about having somebody walk away with a pebble in their shoe, Ray Comfort does a really neat job of having people walk around, walking away, questioning what it is that they think are their values. And that's exactly what you want people to do, because that person then may come back to you and say, what did you mean when you asked me about? Or how do I deal with this particular situation? And now that leads us to the next question. So what is the twofold goal at the end of the day interacting with a woke individual? What's the twofold goal? Number one, simply, calmly, clearly, understandably stating your position, belief, and relationship with Jesus. You want the person with whom you are encountering to know this about you. That means you may have to wait to a very long diatribe or conversation or utterance that they have that may be profanity-filled about their consideration of the world at large today. But one of the things that needs to be with this person when you finish the encounter is your calm, simple, clear, stating your position, your belief and relationship with Jesus. Because sometimes that in itself is the pebble in a person's shoe. Why would you believe in this make-believe thing or personage that I think is only a crutch that people have invented? And if they respect you enough, that becomes a continuing dialogue that happens maybe over the course of years if you've got that long to be able to interact with the person. And then the second point is this: inviting the opportunity to continue the discussion and the conversation. I remember the first time I heard Bruce preach on the Areopagus. And I think because of the nature of Bruce, I think I didn't punch Bruce in the head, but I said, Bruce, there are so many different people who teach that Paul blew it, and you're teaching that this is a good thing. And I said, and I don't like you for teaching that this is a good thing, Bruce. I punch you in the throat now. So when I finished being angry about that, Bruce helped me to understand, because if you read the commentary that Luke writes, not Luke, that son, but Dr. Luke writes, is
all from Dr. Jones' Pa.
Okay, so sorry, Ernie's trying to.
It's Dr. Jones' Pa.
Yeah, okay, shut up. So Luke comments and says, and many weren't won, or few were won to the Lord that day. And it almost reads, without it being their caption, is because he didn't preach Jesus and him crucified.
Your answer. Decline the call.
Decline the call. Sorry, folks. Okay. So he's texting me right now because I think he may be trying to get a part of this conversation. So, okay. Anyway. So I went at Bruce and I said, Bruce, Paul didn't win because he went outside the subject matter. And Bruce said, no, that you're missing the point. The point is he was talking to people who didn't even understand the subject matter to begin with. So he needed to use language and commonality that worked for these folks so that he'd be able, they want to engage with the seed picker another day. So it took me some years, kind of like Hebrews 10, 24, 25. It took me some years to be able to go, okay, maybe I don't want to punch Bruce as hard in the throat. And maybe I'll start praying for him instead of wanting to punch him in the throat or the head, because I get it. But sometimes when you're wedded to certain positions, it takes you a while to get moved off your mountain. And that's why we do Sundays like this. That's why we have this iron, because sometimes there are things that we believed 10 and 5 years ago that when we have a believership crew like this, we can understand the scriptures and how it applies to me better than I understood it 4 or 5 years ago. And again, if you struggle with this, take a look at the woman at the well. She had some kind of scripture, something that was as backwards as all get out. And she came to the table / the well with all of this stuff saying, Jesus, who are you to be able to say this? You're a prophet and all this sort of stuff, but Mount Gerizim, our father, the blah, 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 blah. And sometimes it takes the right encounter to be able to get you off the dodgeball throwing, to get you to put down the bombardment ball because you don't know what you're talking about. And that's a humbling position to be in, but I think it's an okay position to be in if we're about growing in our possession and profession of Jesus. So that's my last point. We're going to get into the scripture and the real truth and consequences next week. Doors open for you guys as we finish up. Right, Gene points out of existence. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Preston, it bears repeating. I've told this story before, but I'll share it very briefly. Remember the story about the gentleman that came to me in the lobby on his second Sunday and told me he was so excited about our church because every time he would go home and read his horoscope, it would line up with my sermon. And now, That's not good news. And so he told me that in front of one of our guys there that was one of our elders named Jim Bolt. Jim Bolt is an engineer for Boeing. So if you think I was floored, Jim Bolt was like questioning his entire salvation history and if we should even be friends anymore. I did not correct this gentleman. He laughed and I was like, hey, see you next week. And Jim was like, why didn't you fix that? He goes, my first question is it true? And I said, no, it's not true, you freak. He said, but why didn't you fix that? And I said, how am I going to fix that? If this guy actually thinks what I'm preaching lines up with this horoscope, he's dealing with very limited knowledge of things, just enough to make it dangerous. My goal is to get him to come back next week, because eventually he'll be like, hey, one of these is not like the other. And that's going to take some time. And so, because horoscopes are so generic, they could apply to anything. So, and so he was wrestling with that. And I told him, just watch. I said this to him, of which he had no answer to. What would you have said to him? And he didn't say anything. I said, are you thinking about your response? He goes, I am. There's so many things that come to my mind. I said, you could have, listen, if you'd have tried to correct that right then, he wouldn't come back. And no, but sometimes we can get very anxious when we feel like someone has disappropriated the truth. We're like, oh, well, we got to fix it right now. You're probably not going to, because there's a conversation piece that needs to happen there that needs to get you to the next one, that needs to get you to the next one, that eventually gets you to the core. But if you lose that early on, you lose it. And so he eventually came back, and 2 months later received Christ and no longer reads his horoscope. And so, and so you're right about the fact sometimes, and I'll say this and then I'll shut up. Geometry is true. It's scientific, but that doesn't matter to a 4-year-old. I don't care how many times you explain it. He's not going to get it. He's just not going to get it. And you can yell at it and say, it's true. It's true. Geometry's been around forever. The Egyptians used it's true. But 4-year-olds like, I don't care. When's snack time? So you have to kind of realize where that person is and be okay with the fact that you didn't drop the resurrection on them in that conversation.
I'm stealing that. Thank you.
Hey, folks, please be aware of the changing environment. I'll throw some things out for you just in case you've not been up to speed. We have a new Rachel Dolezal this weekend, just passed, okay? Professor who's of Jewish heritage, has been a professor of Black Studies for several years, and really felt that she needed to come out of the closet. So please be aware of kind of that. The young lady in the Disney Mulan stated that she supported the Hong Kong police. Because she said that she supported the Hong Kong police, folks want the movie boycott. I'm going to get there too. And so part of the cancel culture has not only made this movie have some repercussions, but this young lady's livelihood may be challenged because she simply said she supported her police that aren't in Hong Kong, where there aren't really people of color. And if you've not taken a look at the interesting, look, I'm not going to tell you take a look at the landscape that is the NBA, because professional sports right now, folks, for you sports fans, you're going to have to really take a hard look at if you want to be sports fans anymore, because our sports were supposed to be where we didn't have to deal with politics, where we didn't have to deal with people taking stupid sides about stuff, because it was just two guys out looking to best each other in either individual fashion or in a team sport. It's no longer that. So you guys are going to have to figure out where you're going to give your extra shekels and attention to. But different from that, watch the Black Panther culture, because that's a moving, interesting piece as well right now. The guy who played T'Challa in the Black Panther from Marvel, they're going to look to probably make this guy a martyr in interesting ways. And, was he a nice young actor? Certainly. But he's no Jesus figure. And if you watch and read a lot of the cultural stuff, even from his hometown, they're looking to prop this guy up as kind of the next Messiah, because of the part he played in a movie, because of the different movie parts that he's played, because of the nobility of him dealing with his illness and how he died and all of this kind of stuff. So don't be surprised if some of this stuff shows up on your door in the way that I say, Christian, don't be surprised by this stuff. Don't be surprised that there's a conversation going on and you're afraid to wade into it, because this is at our doorstep today. And the week that was is going to be different next week with weird. So, times they are changing.
Hey, Preston, just to add to that, Trump just a couple days ago came out and announced a ban on teaching critical race theory on federal government programs. So what you're going to hear is pushback on that from the left, calling him racist, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's something else that I think is probably going to blow up.
Sure. I didn't mention the Trump stuff because I think he also mentioned recently as a part of his platform, if he's reelected, he's going to discontinue funding to Planned Parenthood, federal funding. So anything that this particular president does is going to be identified as racist or whatever, even if it's not the facts or the truth. So this is the world in which we live. Believer, do not be surprised by the weird that gets wielded your way during the week that comes, and look at the alliteration that ain't even like a sermon title.